All right, let's get started on the Ocean Tools overview. We're going to look at the Ocean's toolbar in Houdini. We will be examining the small ocean, the large ocean, the guided ocean layer. We're going to skip the wave tank and the beach tank. Those are more specialized tools. We're also going to look at the flat tank and the ocean flat tank. The small ocean uses the ocean spectrum. This is a way to describe an ocean without doing a simulation. Open oceans would be really hard to describe as a fluid sim, as the number of voxels would be just huge, as you can imagine, in the trillions, I'm sure, depending on the size of the ocean. The ocean spectrum models the effect of constant wind and tidal pull on ocean waves over time. It's based on the latest research into oceans and by actual on-the-ground observation of real oceans. It's an algorithm that takes arguments. In other words, you save out one frame that describes your simulation, and then it's solved at the current time step. It's pre-visible in Houdini as displacement on a grid, but the actual final geometry is rendered as a displacement. Usually, that geometry is a flat grid, and the ocean shader supplies the correct displacement at render time. You can combine multiple ocean spectrums to get different effects, and you can add mass to mimic calm and choppy waters, the areas often seen in large bodies of water, like you see in this image here, where we have the still water close to the camera, and then we have this choppier water and various patches of different frequencies of water. So what is an ocean spectrum? Well, it's important to note that water does not move, waves move. If you look at a large ocean, it shows energy traveling through a medium. The medium obviously is water. If you look at these ropes here, you see that the medium is rope. And of course, the ropes are moving up and down, but they're not moving from left to right. You know, the same part of the rope is always in the same position in X in this image. It's just moving up and down. And it's the same thing with water. There is a little bit of transportation of the water as it's pushed around by the waves, but for the large part, the water is just moving up and down. Multiple waves combine to form an ocean surface. If you take a low frequency sine wave and then a higher frequency sine wave and a higher frequency sine wave and a higher frequency sine wave, and you offset them in different phases, frequencies, and amplitudes, you will get an ocean surface. Phase, frequency, and amplitude define the elementary waves. And this was first modeled by Jerry Tessendorf. There's a famous paper that he did that you can still look up online. And it was first used in CG for Titanic in 1997, which was the first time we saw a photorealistic CG-generated large ocean in a film. So the next tool on the toolbar is the large ocean tool. This uses the ocean spectrum too. It's used, not surprisingly, for large ocean surfaces where tiling artifacts would be noticeable. But it uses wave instancing to remove the visibility of these tiling artifacts. And we're going to go over that in a few minutes. Next, we're going to go to the flat tank. We're going to come back to the guided ocean layer in a minute. The flat tank is simply a flip fluid simulation. It's used for hero splashes. The ocean flat tank is similar to the flat tank, but it adds the ocean spectrum waves at render time. So in other words, you will model your hero splash, and then at render time, you will add the high frequency ocean spectrum onto the render. And through various masking techniques, you can avoid adding the waves from the spectrum onto your splash. The last one we're going to cover today is the guided ocean layer, which is the big enchilada. It uses a flip fluid simulation. It adds the ocean spectrum waves at render time. It also uses the ocean spectrum to seed the flip simulation. So you set up your ocean spectrum, you take the phase, frequency, and amplitude from that ocean spectrum, and that's used to start your flip simulation. This is particularly useful when you have large waves in an ocean integrating with objects. So if you've got a wave that's about as big as the object that's interfacing with the ocean, you probably need a guided ocean layer. If it's a large object and it's a fairly calm ocean, you probably don't notice the influence of the ocean itself on the large object splash, so probably the ocean flat tank is enough. And let's have John Lynch, the Houdini developer, briefly explain how the guided ocean layer works.
And so this is a setup that's really better for larger waves, simulations where the dynamics of the ocean really drive the simulation in a lot of ways. The interaction between the objects and the waves are kind of the primary part of the simulation. And the size of the waves tends to be bigger, or at least as big as the objects we're dealing with. So that's when you would use this versus something like the ocean flat tank. More programmer art here, I apologize, but so you get this sort of idea where we've got an ocean with an object in the middle, and this area in the middle here is obviously simulated, but the surrounding area that matches up very well is just render time displacement. And the idea is that it's fairly tough to tell, even with this kind of close-up static camera, no secondary elements, where the simulation domain is and where the rendered displacement is.
Let's go ahead and start with the small ocean. So I'll just click on the small ocean tool and wait a second for it to do its thing. And let's see what it's added. So we'll go to the object level, and you can see I already have this environment light in here. We've got an ocean surface and an ocean interior. We're not going to really worry about the ocean interior. This is just a way to create like a foggy interior to your ocean so that it doesn't look completely transparent. So we're just going to delete that for now, and we won't deal with that in this tutorial. Go into the ocean surface, and there are all these nodes here. So let's just tidy this up a bit. This stuff here is the ocean foam. We're not going to be dealing with the ocean foam in this tutorial, so I'm going to delete that as well. Over here we have a grid. This is the thing that is actually rendered. We'll come back to that in a second. Here we have the preview grid, a merge, so we can merge in the foam if we want. We're not, like I said, we're not dealing with that, so I'm going to delete that. Here we have another merge where we can merge in multiple ocean spectra, and we're not doing that either, so I'll delete it. So we really get down to this very simple network of nodes here. Let's take a look at what we have here. Here we have a preview grid, and as I said, this is just for preview purposes. I'm going to turn on the headlight here. There we go, so we can see what's happening a little bit better. Again, this grid is not the thing that is actually rendered. If you look at your network of nodes here, you can see that the actual thing that's rendered is this flat grid here. There's no isoparms in here at all. Mantra will take care of dicing this up into the required number of micropolygons at render time. You don't really need any amount of detail on the thing that's actually rendered. This is the display saw, but this is what is actually going to be rendered. As I said, this is just for preview purposes. It's actually not used for anything except that. So really, you don't even need this, but of course you probably would like an idea of what your ocean looks like before you go ahead and start rendering it. So the ocean spectrum, we'll just quickly go over these parameters here. Grid size is the size of the ocean, center obviously where it's centered. The depth is the depth of the ocean in meters. Most of the stuff you probably won't change for most oceans, gravity, etc., etc. The seed is just different random seed, obviously. Time offset and time scale are things you probably won't end up doing too many changes to. Here in the wind tab, that's something you will definitely be playing around with. The direction, obviously, is the direction that the wind is traveling in, so we'll just leave this one alone for now. The speed, if you turn down the speed of the wind, the ocean becomes basically a mirror, which is, you know, if you're ever on a calm lake in the morning and there's no wind at all, it is basically a mirror. So that's what's happening there. As we increase the wind speed, you can see we get these really large low frequency waves. You can see this is what happens in the real world when you've got a very windy ocean. You get these big giant waves going through it. The directional bias, you'll notice some of these waves, they're mostly aligned along the wind direction, but if we change that, we could make this behavior a lot more random. So the waves are kind of going all over the place and they're not really aligned with the wind direction. But if we turn that up, we can make it more, so now they're really aligned with the wind direction. And as we turn it down, they become less and less aligned with the wind direction. So let's turn that way up. And over here, the directional movement, most of the waves are traveling forward, but there's also some waves that reflect and travel backwards. So we can change that so that we get a lot of waves traveling forward and backwards, or we get the waves just traveling in the direction of the wind. The chop adds choppiness to the water. The amplitude, normally you leave this stuff alone. The only time you would play with it maybe is the scale. If you look at your ocean, you say, well, I'm really happy with the way it's behaving, but I just want, you know, the waves in general to be bigger. You would turn that up. You got to be careful with this because it starts to look pretty fake pretty quickly. Wave instancing, we're going to get into that in a bit. Here's the masks. So this mask will allow you to add those flat calm areas that I was telling you about. And right now we do have a mask on here. This is quite a small ocean, so its influence is not really apparent. We'll have a look at that again when we look at the large ocean. So let's say that you're kind of happy with the way this is looking. The most important thing here is that you save out your spectra. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and save it to disk. And you notice that took almost no time whatsoever. That's because the spectra is just a single frame. The only time you need to save out more than one frame of your spectra is if you've animated something in here. Normally you don't animate these things unless you want your ocean maybe to get windier over time, or you want the waves to increase in size over time. Then you might animate it, in which case you need to save out a sequence of frames. But if that hasn't happened, if you don't have any animation here, you only need to save out one frame. So again, the reason for that is the ocean is described by the phase, frequency, and amplitude, and passes those things on to the program, which returns an ocean surface. And if you look here in the geometry spreadsheet, there's the amplitude, here's your offset, p-scale, etc., etc. So everything you see in here are the attributes that are passed on as arguments to the program which returns the ocean surface. Remember I told you this is what actually renders. Let's display the render grid. Let's add a camera. Okay, and let's go to the render view and just render this. So while that's doing that, let's take a look at the material network. So here in the material network, you can see the ocean surface, and here's the key, is this spectrum geometry you see here. If you ever render your ocean and nothing shows up, it's because probably you have not saved out your spectrum geometry. So this geometry is also read by the shader to give you the fully realized ocean surface that you see in the ocean preview over here as a low-res version. So now you can see all the high-res detail in this ocean. Let's look at a few other features of the ocean spectrum SOP. Remember I told you earlier that at some point we're going to take this ocean spectrum and we're going to feed it into our flip solver so that we could seed our flip simulation with the ocean simulation, so that later when we combine the flip simulation with the ocean spectrum, they're going to look integrated. The way we do that is we take our ocean spectrum and we're going to filter out these low frequency waves. So if I go here to the amplitude tab of the ocean spectrum and I click on filter above resolution, you can see that as I go up and down, I'm filtering out the higher frequency waves and I'm just keeping the low frequency waves. So this is what we'll pass on to the flip simulation. Now similarly, you can do the other way around. You can filter out the low frequency waves and just keep the high frequency waves. The other thing I mentioned is that you can combine multiple ocean spectra. So I'm going to make a copy of that one and I'm going to put down a merge here. And we'll take a look. So now, because these are exactly the same, you can see all that it's doing is doubling the amplitude of our simulation. But if we were to change these things, for example, I'll turn down my wind speed, and now we're combining the two together. So this is a way that you could have a calm area, and then you can have a choppy area somewhere else with a completely different behavior very easily just by combining multiple spectra. Of course, the other way to do this calm, choppy thing is with the masks, which we will again talk about later. So let's talk a little bit about wave instancing, which is going to be used when we look at the large ocean. So if I put down an add SOP, which simply adds a single point, so I go here and add a single point at the origin, and if you put your mouse over the inputs on the ocean spectrum SOP, you can see wave instancing points there and mask input here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a single point, which of course is right there. And you can see what it's doing to the ocean. It's basically acting as a copy SOP, right? It's copying a wave to that point. If you go to the ocean spectrum here, you can see that we can change the radius of that. We could rotate these around. We could change the amplitude, offset, etc., etc. So if we add more points, we're going to get more of these. Let's go ahead and scatter some points on this. And oops, so we'll just plug that in like that. And let's just scatter a lot less points and let's plug that in there. So now you can see this is where we scattered the points and we're getting these waves instanced on here. So imagine that you've got a giant ocean. Let's take this ocean here. And the ocean is so big that we can see that they're little tiles, and you can see these tiling artifacts. So I'm going to merge these two together, and I'm going to make sure that I disconnect the instancing from the second one. So if I've only got the second one in there, we've got this. But if I merge the two together, we're now going to get the effect of these scattered waves combined with the existing ocean. So this is the way we can hide the tiling artifacts, just by adding these waves randomly around the surface. The other thing that's worth noting is if you look at the ocean spectrum, you can see that we've got these controls for rotation, radius, amplitude, and offset. These can also be overwritten with geometry attributes. So let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to put down a point wrangle or an attribute wrangle here, and we're going to give this a new amplitude. So I'm going to say f at amplitude equals 10. Okay, so nothing happens. We have to turn off this amplitude here because that's overriding our point attribute. And you can see now we've got this outrageous amount of amplitude on those waves. So let's just turn that down to something more reasonable. Okay, so in this way you can control the wave instancing through point attributes. Okay, I've added the large ocean to this scene. If we go inside the node that's added, the ocean surface, we can see something that looks quite familiar. I'm going to get rid of the ocean foam because we're not going to be doing the ocean foam. Over here we have our preview grid just as before, and we have our render grid up here. Now we've plugged in a scatter because we're going to be doing some wave instancing on the grid that's rendered. And here we've split, so we've added 2,000 points here, and all we're doing here is splitting half the points into this side and half the points into that side. So you middle click here, see there's 1,000 points there and 1,000 points there. Now you'll notice that when you look at the preview in here, we don't really see much of an ocean surface. That's because we're so far away from it. This ocean is now super big. It is 8,000 meters, so 8 kilometers wide. So we don't really see those individual waves here. You can actually see the effect of those waves if you just go crazy with one of these scales, and you can see those are the ocean waves there. But of course that looks ridiculous because we're tens of kilometers away from the surface right now. Okay, so what's happening here? We've added half the points we're doing wave instancing here and half the points we're doing wave instancing here. So if we were to just plug this into here, and again, we're just going to use that trick of increasing the amplitude, and you can see that our grid is scattered with waves. And over here, if we plug this one in, you can see that this grid is scattered with waves in a different position. And then as we said, we can combine these two together and we get an untiled looking simulation. We look over here at the render view. This render here, I've turned on the masking so that we can get some calm areas in here. And in this render, the masking is off. So adding this masking really helps to improve the look of a large ocean, by mimicking the calm areas that you see. Maybe I went a bit overboard because it is quite flat in some areas, but you get the picture. So let's have a look at what this would look like if we weren't using wave instancing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this ocean spectrum in alone. I'm going to take away the wave instancing, and I'm going to make sure that I save out my spectra. So I press save to disk, and now I've got the spectra saved out without the wave instancing. And to spare you the excitement waiting for the render, I've done it beforehand, and you can see this is now what our ocean looks like. You can see the ocean is tiling because it's repeating all the way to infinity. It looks terrible. It looks like it's 1994 all over again. So this is really why we have to use wave instancing on these super large oceans. Okay, let's have a look at the rest of the tools. So we're going to look at the flat tank first. Hit the flat tank button, hit enter and enter, and it puts down a few nodes. So let's go to the object level. Let's get rid of the fluid interior. We know we don't want to deal with that right now. So we've got the flat tank initial and the flat tank fluid. So the flat tank initial just sets up the initial conditions for our flip simulation. We're going to turn off the merge collisions because there are no collisions right now. Wave tank, this is a defined region where we're going to do something. So in a minute I'm going to show you, I took a little box and I made it splash into this wave tank. What happens next is we separate the initial particles, which are here. If you middle click, you see that we've got 115,000 particles, and we've got a surface volume. So this also gives us a surface volume as a separate output, which is what we need for the waterline when we do a waterline simulation. This will prevent the particles from escaping from our box. So we want this to look like an infinite surface. Once they go beyond this point, they shouldn't pour out the side of the box. Once we've got that set up, we then run our simulation, and here we're bringing in our flat tank, we're doing our flip solver, And that's pretty much it. Now, nothing's going to happen in this because we don't have any collisions or anything exciting happening. And in a minute, I'll show you how we're going to do that. And the flat tank fluid just imports the fluid, compresses it, we save out the compressed cache, we then surface it, and finally we save out the surfaced cache. So how do we combine a flip simulation with a spectrum? I'm going to do a quick review of how that is done. So over here I've got a simple cube that's going to be coming down and splashing into our ocean. Let's just assume that we've done our flip simulation. We've got our cube going into our tank, which is going to be that thing. And we've saved out our cache. And this is what it looks like when it's saved out. If you put in a convert, oops, just put in a convert stop. Can't type today. There we go, convert. So that's approximately what our simulation looks like. The particle fluid surface has an option in the regions tab. If we use the bounding box, we can then extend this out as far as we want. So if I display the particle fluid surface, it's now going to surface this simulation, but it's also going to create a great big grid that extends as far out as we want it to. So the splashes from the collider are coming in, causing these giant waves. But of course, the waves that are on the rest of the ocean, we're going to get them from the spectrum. Okay, so what we've got here is we're taking our initial simulation and then we just extrude it out in all these directions. Because remember, this just needs to be a flat plane and we're going to be putting our spectrum on top of it. So how did that RBD convert constraints get in there? That shouldn't be there. Okay, so there's our particle fluid surface. So you can see here that we can extend the distance that we extrude this as far as we want. And we can add these divisions, but these divisions aren't really necessary because, again, it can just be a simple polygonal grid with no isoparms whatsoever, and it will work just fine. So remember, what's going to happen at render time is we're going to add the displacements from the spectrum on top of it, and it's going to look like an ocean. Now, one thing though, we don't want to add the displacements on top of these displacements because that's going to look weird. So what we do is we mask out this area here. We only add the high frequency displacements to this, and the low frequency displacements are masked out. Let's see that in action. We're going to go to the ocean flat tank and hit enter, enter. Wait a few seconds. And as before, we've got something that looks very similar. We've got our flat tank initial. We've got our flat tank fluid. We've got our flat tank interior, so we're going to get rid of that. And we got our flat tank extended, and there's our DOP network. Okay, so the flat tank initial looks a lot like what we saw before. We can just delete these. We've got our wave tank here. We've got our, and we're now splitting out our particles from our volumes. Okay, inside the DOP network, as before, nothing different there. Flat tank fluid. Here's where we're saving out that fluid simulation. And finally, here's the flat tank fluid extended. And this is where we're taking, we'll just tidy this up a little bit. Okay, we're bringing in our cached simulation, and then we're doing the extension that I showed you here, right? So we're bringing in our cache simulation, we're doing the extension, and we're going to render this out. Now, all this stuff over here, this is what's going to sort out the spectrum for us. This looks pretty daunting when you look at this, but what's happening here is we've got our fluid. It goes into this particle fluid mask, and the idea here is that we want to take, well, actually, let's look at my finished one. It'll be a bit easier. Okay, we've got our simulation here. Let me go to this view. There we go. We've got our simulation. We've got our spectrum here, and we want to use a mask. This is what it looks like with the mask, right? So this is where we're going to use the low frequency waves in our final render. And over here is a high frequency mask. This doesn't look like much when we look at it. It's going to be a big box, but we're bringing in our high frequency waves on top of the whole thing. We're merging those two things together. We need to save out the mask for every frame. So that's why this is a sequence of frames. You can see 1 to 240, and this is a single frame. Then we merge them together and it goes into the ocean evaluate. Again, what's happening in the shader, of course, if we go here to the displacement, here we now have the spectrum geometry and the mask geometry. So it's really important that these are saved out. The spectrum is one frame unless you've animated something in the spectrum, and the masks are a sequence of frames, of course, because this mask changes depending on what's happening with the splash. And that's it really at render time. It's just this sort of flat grid with our low frequency big splashes waves added on top of it. And if we're looking through this camera, this is going to look a bit weird if you see this kind of corner here. And you're probably wondering, well, how can I make this look like an ocean that goes all the way to the horizon? Well, there's this node called the circle from edges. You can use that. So we just drop one of those down here. And what it's going to do is put a big circle around here. So let's just zoom out a little bit. And we can just click on the radius here, and we'll make this as big as we want. And now if you look through the camera, it's hard to tell that that is not a flat horizon if you make it big enough. Okay, so I know I went through that really quickly, so let's actually, do a simulation together. We've talked about the ocean flat tank. We're actually going to use the guided ocean layer instead. And the reason we're going to do that is because the ocean flat tank is very similar to the guided ocean layer. The difference, again, is that we're actually going to feed the initial spectrum into the guided ocean layer so that we get our big waves, so they will interact with our spinning dude here. We want the waves that are in the ocean to interact also with the waves that are generated by this thing that hits the surface. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on the guided ocean layer tool, enter and enter, and wait a second. We'll go up to the object level, and we've got this mess of nodes here. So let's just move all this stuff out of the way. So these are the things that were here already. Let's get rid of the interior, just to make things a little bit clearer. Here is our guided ocean layer initial. So this is where we're going to set up this wave tank here. Okay, I'll turn that off for a second. This is our initial wave tank. This is where we take the results of the simulation and we extend it. Oh, and this is where, of course, we import the fluid from the simulation. And this is where the simulation is done. So in our collider, we've got a box, and it's just sitting there. And what I've done is I've done a VDB from polygons. So then we have this bad boy, and we're calling this collide. Okay, and then we're transforming it so that it moves through the scene. And the reason I'm transforming it after we do the VDB from polygons is so that we don't have to calculate the VDB again every time. So we've got a VDB out, and we've got a reference copy where it's doing exactly the same thing with the geometry, and that's our geometry out. Over here we have our AutoDop network. Let's put this into manual mode for a second, go in there and hit layout. So here's our flip fluid object. Here is our guiding ocean volume. We'll have to talk about this in a second. This is what's going to bring in the initial wave motion from the spectrum for us. Okay, let's add our collision. So we're going to put down a static object, and we're going to plug it in over here and Shift R. Okay, so we'll call this collider, and we want to get this thing here. So this is our collider, so let's just copy that. Oops, what did I do? I accidentally deleted something. There we go. Copy that. Okay, we'll go back inside. We'll say that this is our SOP path. Object collider out, use deforming geometry. In the collisions tab, we're going to change it to use volume collisions. We're going to say volume sample, and then we're going to point it to the VDB here. So I'm just pasting the same thing and changing it to the VDB. So up here we've got the SOP path to our polygonal geometry. We don't need the object path because it's not deformed at the object level or transformed at the object level. And over here, object collider VDB out is the volume. Over here we have the guided ocean volume. So if we go into one of these objects, we can again get rid of these collisions. Let's bring this up over here. So here we have our ocean spectrum. We'll just turn this back on to auto update. So this is what we want our ocean to look like. This is a pretty wavy ocean. Actually, it's a bit out of control. Maybe we should make that a little bit, turn the amplitude down. Okay, I'm going to make that about 3. All right, so there we've got our ocean spectrum. So we want actually this movement to come into the flip simulation so that those things can interact with each other. So there's our guided ocean, there's our ocean spectrum, and then we feed that into the wave tank. You can see the first input in the wave tank is an ocean spectrum. So if we look at that wave tank now, it's actually got the movement from the ocean in it. Okay, so that we should file cache that out. So that will be enough. Okay, so that's file cache to disk. And here we have the ocean surface. Now these aren't going to look like anything because these are volumes. So there's the surface, there's the velocity, there's the sink, and there is the guiding surface. So if you want to know what these things do, it's best to look at John Lynch's masterclass. He goes into that in quite a bit of detail. But if you want to see what these things look like, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. But if you put down a primitive SOP, for example, you can just go here and you can turn that on, and then the volumes, you can turn on the visualization, and we could look at this as an ISO surface, for example. So there's that surface there. Okay, so we've now cached out our wave tank, and these are the initial conditions of our wave tank. So now if we go back in here to this guided ocean volume, just put that back onto manual mode for a second. Okay, surface velocity and sink are being used in the guided ocean volume, and they're pumped into the flip solver. Okay, so I'm going to save out this simulation, and we'll come back in a second when that's done. I cache those files to disk now, and the compressed ocean is going to look like this. So it doesn't look like much until you either convert it or you surface it. So here I've also cached out the surface, and these nodes are already in here, so you just have to cache them out. And if I press play, you can see that this is the effect that we've got. So we've got my little cube interacting with the water, but we also have the water interacting with the cube. So there's the surface cache, and there's the surface preview. We're going to need to integrate this into our entire ocean. So how do we do that? Okay, let's go into our guided ocean layer fluid extended. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is reorganize this a little bit. We will import the cache fluid over here. We're getting that from the guided ocean fluid compressed cache. So that is here. This, of course, is doing what I explained earlier. If we use the regions and we turn on use bounding box, we can then extend this to, well, as far as we want. We'll make the extrude distance, let's say 200. Okay, and let's look through the camera, and we can still maybe see that this is not to the horizon, so we're going to put down one of those circle from edges node. I'll put that in there, and we'll make sure that it's big enough. I'll turn on the radius and just crank that up. There we go. And now it looks like it's going to the horizon. Let's just see what this looks like. Okay, so obviously it's a very low res sim, so it's going to look a bit weird. But you'll notice that we've got these waves here, which came from the ocean spectrum, right? These big waves. So what we don't want to do is take our ocean spectrum and add those waves, those low frequency waves on again, because these waves will be twice as big if we do that. So what we want to do is say, where we've got this simulation, our flip simulation here, we want to, keep that, but we want to mask out the low frequency waves there in the spectrum. We want to add the high frequency waves on top of it, and we want to have the high frequency and low frequency waves everywhere else. So that's what this is all doing. So here we're importing the spectrum. Over here, we're taking this simulation and we're masking it. So if you look here, well, that's our high frequency mask. That's not going to look like much. Let's look at our low frequency mask. This is the mask here. So wherever we've got our flip simulation, we are going to make sure that when we go to render it, we don't add these low frequency waves back in as a displacement. However, we do want the high frequency waves to be everywhere, and that's what this mask is for. So we're merging the spectras together, and then we're baking them out. So this one here is going to be the ocean spectrum, and this one here is going to be our masks. Okay, so if you middle click on these, you can see this phase, frequency, amplitude, and this one here is, and this one here are the masks. We merge them together. For this spectrum, again, it's just a single frame, and this one here is the entire range, because of course this mask changes over time. So I'm going to just pause it while I save those out. Okay, so I've saved out those masks. And of course you can see if we go to the material that we're using, the masks here and the spectrum. Okay, so the Ocean Evaluate shows us the flattened extended simulation without the ocean spectrum added back in, and this shows it with the ocean spectrum added back in. Now, of course, the thing that's actually going to render is over here. So let's just render that and see how it looks. And so this is what it will look like when it's rendered with our collision object in red and our terrible super low res flip fluid sim included. I know that this is actually quite complex, and especially when you look inside here and you see, well, we've got a lot of red flags because I've only simulated the 50 frames. But if you tear this apart and examine these nodes one by one, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So again, here we're bringing in our imported flip fluid simulation. Here we are surfacing it with extending the regions all the way out to the horizon. Just pause that and take a look at it. All right, so we're just extending our regions out to the horizon here with this particle fluid surface and the circle from edges. We now have our hero splash with a flat grid. Over here, using these two masks, we're isolating the high and low frequencies, and we're saving out our ocean spectrum and our masks over here. And then, of course, when we go to render, the shaders using the spectrum and the masks to apply a displacement shader to this whole thing. And if we come back here, you'll notice that we've filtered out the low frequency big waves here, and we've replaced them with the waves that are introduced in the flip simulation, but we've added the high frequency waves back onto everything. All right, so again, I really strongly suggest you watch John Lynch's masterclass now that you've got a basic overview of this, and you'll have a much greater understanding of what's going on. I'd like to thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please shoot me an email, sean@lostboysstudios.com. If you're interested in attending the school, please visit our webpage for more information. Thank you, and I look forward to talking to you in the chat if you've got any questions.